Hey guys, welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. My name is Ben. Today I'm welcoming back Meg, and we're talking about the new Jedi Order series. This is our second conversation. Meg, please introduce yourself to the crowd who is seeing you for the first time on my channel. Tell us what your channel is all about and where they can find your stuff.
Yeah, hi, I'm Meg Reviews on YouTube. I read Star Wars books, some of the new books, but mostly the old Legends books. Last year, I reread all of the new Jedi Order series, and this year I am revisiting all the prequel stories that came out between 1999 and 2005. I'm also on Instagram as well, where I mostly post like Star Wars outfits.
Nice. So guys, just to give you a quick recap before we jump into it, our first video focused on a kind of like a general talk around the series. And of course, we had to spend a lot of time with the first initial book, Vector Prime, because it's the origin of the entire story. We really wanted to delve into characters, into the main conflict and stuff like that. But just to give you a quick gist, what this series is all about, if you're new to Star Wars Expanded Universe, if you're hearing the term New Jedi Order for the first time, it's a series of 19 books, including short stories and e-novellas, which were written from 1999 to 2003. And it includes all of the books which are now considered legends, right? They're not part of the current canon. And they portray the events which take place from 21 to 25 years after the original movie, A New Hope, or what is considered the Battle of Yavin, which obviously happens at the end of that movie. Luke Skywalker is in full swing restoring the new Jedi Order when this galaxy being invaded by these intergalactic invaders, and there's a whole new conflict, and the whole series was a promise of a slew of new villains, new heroes joining the original cast in the sweeping new tale of the Jedi Order. I think I'm getting it pretty much summed up, right? And then, of course, I wanted to recap on Vector Prime itself, if you don't mind. You know, what we discussed in the previous conversation, Vector Prime was just a Nominor Yomenkar at Belkadan. These new invaders, the Yuzong Van, they are the frontier, the frontmen, or so to speak, the infiltrators, the scouts of this new force which is about to invade. We talked about Mara's illness, which was quite mysterious for both of us, and we didn't know where it's coming from. We talked about Luke Skywalker's apprentice, Kip Duran, his first encounter and loss to this new Yuzong Van warriors. And of course, huge spoiler alert, guys, which is obviously this entire conversation will be populated by spoilers. If you are planning to reading this series, please turn away now, because we're going to talk about this series at length. And of course, Chewie's death. We ended up on a note, you and I, talking about how there was this foreshadowing sense of things, like a foreboding atmosphere of things to come. And the first question I have for you is, how did it feel? We transfer from one author to the next, right? We started with R.A. Salvatore, and now we're switching to Michael Stackpole's duology, which we're going to talk about here, Dark Tide Part 1 and Part 2. How did the transition feel for you personally?
I felt like it was pretty smooth. Obviously, Stackpole focuses on different things than Salvatore. Salvatore is really focusing on, you know, the original trio from the movies and Han and Leia's children and Lando, you know, Kype Durin, and then the use involved in some new characters. And with it switching to Michael A. Stackpole, he brings in a lot more of the Jedi and a lot more of the current conflicts that exist between the different divisions in the Jedi Order. He brings Rogue Squadron back in. He brings more of like the New Republic military in. And then we're also introduced to another segment of the Yuuzhan Vong force, which is Shadao Shai of Domain Shai and his forces, and you know how they start attacking in the galaxy.
I wanted to ask you, in regards to nuance, did you feel a certain difference in terms of style or maybe pacing of the story, and did it at any time feel jarring to you, or like a smooth continuation of one connected story, right? Because a lot of Star Wars fans, especially today, try to compare it to the Star Wars canon and say which one felt more connected, like one continuous story. So in regards to style and direction here, how did you feel?
Yeah, I felt like I thought the Vector Prime was very interesting because it had the feeling of a thriller at times, especially in the scenes on Belkadan, where you just had this feeling of unease and you weren't sure what was going to happen next.
Yeah.
Especially because the Yuuzhan Vong are so completely new. And to me, the Dark Tide trilogy felt a lot more like a Bantam era Star Wars book. It felt like I guess like a return to that style, which was very almost comfortable for me because I had read so many of them at that point. But I felt like with the almost like expanded cast of characters, I sort of like that return to more of the normal space opera feel than the more like intense thriller that Vector Prime was at times.
I think once again, Meg, I'm going to return to the fact that when I started reading that series, my English level was nowhere near where it's now, right? I was 4 or 5 years in the country. And I think Vector Prime set the tone because of the content in the book. Like it felt dark, foreboding, kind of like a new styled Star Wars, which felt like it has grown a lot and it's addressing a new, mature audience a lot more. And honestly, I didn't feel distinctive difference in terms of style overall. I felt like it's continuing that darker thread and it's going to pick up. You know, I really felt like I'm reading chapters of one book. From Vector Prime to Dark Tide 1 and 2, I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like you obviously see a different author in the book, but it really, really felt connected. And it's interesting now that you also mentioned that both authors are tackling different kinds of material. But I would say that comparing R.A. Salvatore's to Michael Stackpole's styles, I think both are very versatile authors, but also very effective in all aspects of good storytelling when we're talking about character development or describing a tense scene or just describing the environment which the characters occupy. Or when they switch gears and start showing us a more action-oriented scene with a lot of technical stuff and terminology or space battles. I think it was very successful to have these authors take turns specifically early on in the series because the transition, at least to me, I don't know, maybe you'll add something to it, but to me it felt like a very smooth, like a continuation, like you're following the chapters of the same book.
Yeah, it definitely felt like, for me, picking up, especially the first Dark Tide book, it felt like no time had elapsed since Vector Prime, and I was like going right into the next story. Yeah. And sometimes, you know, especially for a series where there's multiple authors writing, you pick up the next one and like a year has elapsed or time has elapsed. And in that, it felt like I picked it up and it was immediately continuing on from where Vector Prime left off, which I did find, really, really interesting.
So we have a lot of ground to cover, guys. We're going to discuss 2 books because Meg and I, we kind of convened, we discussed this and like, hey, no way we're going to do a podcast per book. There's just too much to cover. So we're going to go by sets, right? Vector Prime kind of made sense to talk about individually. Now we're going to talk about this duology. 2 books, which quite interesting. Before we pressed the record, you told me that it was planned as a trilogy, which I was not aware of at all.
Yes.
What's up with that?
So very interesting. I don't think there was a lot of information on this until recently, and within the last few years, Stackpole in an interview shared that when he turned in the manuscript for Dark Tide Onslaught, they returned it to him and they wanted him to change a lot of things. And he wasn't really happy with all the things they wanted him to change. And at the same time, they sort of wanted to focus more on Han because at the time, James Luceno was only supposed to write a single book called The Agents of Chaos. So what ended up happening was the second book in the Dark Tide trilogy, Siege, was, just slashed, cut out. The Dark Tide trilogy became a duology, and then Agents of Chaos had an extra book added on so that it could become a duology. So I think that Siege probably would have covered just building tensions, the refugee situation, maybe another battle. But the key stuff that Stackpole wanted to tell in the trilogy still ended up in Onslaught and Ruin.
That's maybe interesting. So it's almost like, a showrunners on a TV show, right? They have to manage authors and figure out where and how to plug story elements to make it all work in concert. And guys,
Yeah.
honestly, this is why you go to Meg's channel and check it out right after this podcast, because if you want detailed like information of Star Wars books, what comes from where, Meg, you go really, really deep into this stuff. And I think it's such a valuable resource of the stuff that you're creating. I think our fans will just like really, really appreciate all of that, especially for newcomers who are jumping in this new Jedi Order series. Was actually two of my friends that I podcast with, Josh on Star Wars on High, and Jimmy from Star Wars Complete. Both of them just started New Jedi Order. I'm like, dudes, finally, I can't wait for you to talk about this, right? But let's get on with it. We're going to discuss first part of this podcast, The Dark Tide Onslaught, the book which came out in February of 2000. And this is basically, we see Jedi in action. This is where we see Luke as the leader of this new Jedi Order. He needs to now to respond to threats. I will basically just go over my notes as like cliffhangers, just cliff notes, some key moments that I wanted to outline, and feel free to kind of plug in. And along the way, I will ask you a couple of questions that I'm curious to find out what you thought on them. So, as I mentioned, Luke decides to act. He decides that he wants to control things, and he handpicks specific Jedi that he couples them, and he says, you got to go on recon missions. It's not our time to join the battlefield. It's not the Clone Wars version, like we're going to become generals overnight. He's more reserved in his decisions. And he puts Jason along with him. They go back to Belkaden, and they want to, what they find out there is they basically discover a bunch of slaves who are tasked by the Yuzang Vong to grow their new biotechnology, the Coral Skippers. He tasks Corran Horn and Ganner, two very unlikely Jedi, which are characteristically very, very different. He sends them on Bimmel, and there they encounter some scientists who are excavating this site, which has remains of ancient or old Vong, which have previously visited this galaxy. And of course, there's this whole outpost. They discover some old bones. Guys, cliff notes, remember. We see Mara, Jade, and Anakin. They're on Dantooine, and now Anakin is obviously dealing with the events of a previous book where he participated in the scene where Chewbacca died. If you guys want to find out the details on that, we will drop the comment to that our previous conversations so people can catch up. Anakin is continuing to learn his Force lessons from Mara, but also learns about the patience. And this is where we see a divergence of destinies. Anakin versus Jason and Anakin's future. And Jason loses his fight with the Vong, and there is this huge capture and torture by his enemy's hands. We have this embrace of pain scene, and there's foreshadowing of things to come for Jason as well. Meg, feel free to once again encompass anything that I didn't catch that you might find noteworthy. And I wanted to ask you a question. What was your impression of story pacing so far in the book?
I really liked Onslaught. I felt like, especially for me, actually all of them, the scenes with Cord and Ganner, the scenes with Luke and Jason, and especially the scenes with Anakin and Mara on Tatooine, just everything was so tense and like this definite feeling of unease because they're on these recon missions and they don't know what they're going to find. And even for Anakin and Mara, who are supposedly in a safe place so that Mara can recover, and you just get this sense of like things are not going to go as everyone plans them to, which so definitely made me turn the pages because you want to know, like, how is this going to be resolved? Like, what's going to happen next? Especially the scenes with Luke and Jason on Belkaden. Like, there are bits there that are really, really intense where you're like, oh no, like, what will happen next?
Where young Jason is, obviously he's older than Anakin, but he is in that teenage age group where he starts testing. He tests adults around him. He tests Luke's. What I really enjoyed about his character is that he also questions his path from the beginning. He is confident and bold, and there's definitely a teenage spirit to him where like he wants to be confrontational. He's a maximalist. Everything with teenagers is extremes. Nothing is smooth. Nothing is, even scales. And But it's really nice to see a teenager who has a lot of retrospect, and he looks at himself. He's like, "Hey, this is the right way." And then, of course, teenagers, they mimic adults. It's practice what you preach. If Luke says one thing and acts differently, of course, Jason is going to either emulate that or question that, depending on what kind of personality you are. Obviously, Jason is a lot more strong-willed. And my next question is, I know you had a lot to say about Luke throughout your reviews. When I was watching, there's a lot of things which I felt like my feelings conflicted with yours, but it was fascinating to listen how another huge passionate Star Wars fan is reacting to Luke's methods. So how did you feel about Luke's methods at this point in the story? What were your frustrations with him?
I think I understood Luke wanting information because at this point in the series, they know so little about the Yuuzhan Vong. They don't really know their goals beyond conquest and violence. And so it makes sense for him to, send people out. But at the same time, there is a huge group within the Jedi Order, sort of spearheaded by Kype Durrin, who want to take immediate action against the Vong. They want to take like the Clone Wars approach and just jump into battle right away. And I felt like, I guess what frustrated me reading it was I can understand why Luke does what he does, but I always felt like you really should have like brought the hammer down on that group sooner. But I know he doesn't want to be like a tyrant, like he wants people to be able to make their own choices, but at the same time, like there is this like almost warmongering group within the Jedi Order at this point in the series, and they almost like not get their own way, but they're rather loud about it. And I was always surprised by like how loud Luke allowed.
That's a good word to describe it. And I think you and I we talked about which books we sort of consider vital to reading prior to starting New Jedi Order. And I think a lot of the Jedi Academy trilogy by Kevin J. Anderson seeps right into it and into Luke's decision-making. Because in the Jedi Academy trilogy, his students encounter this ancient spirit of Exar Kun. And not only his students are being tested to their absolute limits, but Luke as well. And not just in terms of physicality or in terms of wisdom in the Force, but also as a human being. It's like, hey, where do I go from this? We need to learn from the past mistakes where the Jedi were. And obviously, of course, guys, this is before even the prequel era, as far as the Jedi Academy is concerned. And we sort of get a completely different feeling of who the Jedi were Star Wars prequels, but even there we understand that Jedi Order has failed. It has fallen, and the Empire has swept everything away. But anyway, it felt like Luke is trying to me, he's trying to navigate this course carefully, because the repercussions could be much more devastating, not just in relationship with this new enemy, this new threat, but within the Jedi Order. So if I understand correctly, your frustration wasn't with how the authors treated Luke, but with Luke himself as a character, what he was doing, right?
Yeah. And I think within the New Jedi Order series, there's this conflict almost where the Jedi Order, as we saw it in the earlier books before the New Jedi Order came out, was very like free. There wasn't, a hierarchy beyond like, oh, I'm a Jedi Master, I'm a Jedi Knight. There wasn't sort of like this system set in place or anything. And in Vector Prime, Luke brings up the idea to the Senate that he would like to institute a Jedi Council. And so I think that's a lot of what the New Jedi Order has to come to terms with, is that the New Jedi Order as it existed before the Yuuzhan Vong invasion was unstructured. And for it to really face this threat, it has to get some structure put in place. But at this time in the series, they still haven't really gotten anything in place. And, Luke's the leader, but we don't have council members, or we have people who are Jedi Masters, but it's much more like loosey-goosey at this stage.
Yeah. You get a sense that prior to Jedi Order, it's like the line in the sand has been drawn, because prior to that point, Luke kind of tried to be the captain of the ship by example. People honestly revered him. People respected and admired and loved him. His students, Leia, the council, everyone's like, hey, he's the hero in every sense of the word. And like you mentioned before, there wasn't a sense of like this hierarchy, which we later see in the prequels, which to this day for me, I'm struggling with that still. It's very hard for me to embrace and accept that. But that's what Star Wars is. That's part of the story. It's George's story, and the authors kind of like made an extension that's why it's called the expanded universe. But anyway, we are back with Mara and Anakin being saved by Luke and Jason, I believe, right? At the end of the book, they come at the last moment. And then there is this battle of Drubrillion, and we see this massive loss of life because these attackers, these Yuuzhan Vong, they have no respect for warfare, the rules of war. They just attack the escaping, fleeing ships of the refugees. And but Corran and Ganner on the Bimmel, they're able to save their scientist. But Corran nearly dies because of how they go about it. It's like a very, very tense moment, tense scene. And we sort of end up with this book promising that we'll continue with part 2. But before we move on and talk about Dark Tide 2, what I wanted to ask you is, because I will return to the same question once again, the conversations that Anakin has with Mara, and then the philosophical differences that Jason begins to demonstrate versus Luke's teachings, what's happening here? Is it their environments shaping these two young men to go in the opposite ways, or was it predetermined all the way from the beginning by the will of the Force? How did you view this?
I thought it was very much environmental, because I see Anakin's time with Mara as Mara's pushing him to sort of reconsider a lot of his preconceptions. Anakin especially has this propensity to just rely on the Force over anything else. And Mara tries to show him, like, you can't just use the Force for everything. Like, you have to train yourself, you have to gain wisdom and understanding and knowledge. And you can't just like rely on the Force for everything. And with Jason, it's that he's not really sure how he fits in the Jedi Order. He doesn't see himself as this warrior like his uncle was and like his brother shaping up to be. He's very questioning. And I thought that especially his scenes on Belkanon, where he had a vision of himself freeing the slaves, he goes to carry it out and he fails.
And he fails.
He's not that good of a fighter yet. And so, I think it's very interesting the different paths they're taking, that Anakin seems like he's on the path of the hero, but at the same time, Mara's giving him pushback that like, if you just act the hero, like that's not good enough. And then Jason, who doesn't know really what he wants, but he's questioning things, and like that just feels like such a teenager to me, that, he hasn't figured out his role in things, and he's gonna,
he is like a questioning young man, but at the same time, he feels like an old soul as well. He's the warrior poet, right? He's like, at one point he rushes into things, but at another point in his youth, he's so brooding, and he's constantly thinking and evaluating things. And to me, honestly, this is where you and I not necessarily disagree, but just like view it a little bit from a different, not context, but like from a different, I guess, worldview. Yeah. Where I almost feel to every Kylo Ren there has to be Rey, because to me the Star Wars sequels were all about amplifying the idea of the balance of the Force of good versus evil times 10. And I think a lot of fans responded that it moves too quickly. It tries to do things to accomplish things without too much recourse. It's just things are just popping off real quick. I think because J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson tried to kind of like elevate this, say, hey, you guys know the formula. We're going to amp it up, to times 10.
Yeah, but the idea, make it like very mythic.
Right, but the idea always was that to every good, there must be evil. A good cannot coexist on its own, and so can't evil. And when I was reading into Jason's and Anakin's stories in this duology, to me, it felt like a combination of the environment, but also destiny. Let me explain why. Because obviously the environment, the kind of teachers and mentors that you have, the kind of people that you bond with and build relationships who are your own age group, that kind of plays into what your future decisions will be. But at the same time, I don't believe that Anakin would have absorbed and taken to heart all Mara's teachings if he wasn't the person that he is. And I don't think Jason would have listened, really listened and processed what Luke is telling him. He didn't ignore his teacher, but still act out in a particular way that he did because the way that he is. And it couldn't have been any other way, no matter what Luke have done or Han Solo has done later on. Obviously, Luke and Han trying to influence their son Jason. Regardless of what the adults would do here, they're insignificant next to this huge destiny thing going on with the characters.
Yeah, and I think definitely Jason, I think a lot of Jason's struggles within the Jedi Order is that Jason doesn't feel himself called to be a warrior. He feels himself called to be like a philosopher, a scholar. And that's not a bad thing. It's just as we read the books, we see Jason struggling with that, sort of like the expectations for him because of his family versus like what he feels he wants to do.
Well, we're moving now into part 2, Dark Tide, The Ruin, right? This is same year, June 2000. And I honestly, I got to say, these two read like one book. I don't know why it was separate. Like, you really need, because part 1 doesn't even end on a cliffhanger. It's like, just wait a little bit, half a year, book 2 is coming. And then you get to part 2, and then you get the complete picture. And here we see finally Jedi in full swing action. We see Luke taking a more proactive role, and we see the new Jedi Order being put under its first major stress test, right? We have Luke and Anakin searching for this Twi'lek Deshara core, who was Kib Duran's student. And as we spoke in our previous podcast, Kib Duran is this maverick Jedi who's swaggering in, he's confident, and because he was introduced by Han Solo, he feels like he's the big shot. He questions Luke every step of the way. Anyway, this Deshara core Twi'lek was trained by Kib Duran. And she turns rogue, and she plans on avenging her fellow Jedi and the New Alliance. And she wants to destroy the Yuuzhan Vong by any means possible, even if it leads her to the dark side. And here is the rippling effect, which has consequence on the entire New Jedi Order and actually the next series, The Legacy. Because Kib Duran trains Deshara. Deshara trains another huge figure in Star Wars, LMRR, who in turns trains Jason, right? And there we have our chain. First of all, how does it feel rereading all of these books and be able to now trace all of these events and like linking them together, like, oh, this is where they were going. How did you feel about that?
It's really interesting sort of seeing the progression. And I think the way that Kype's approach affected people that weren't even part of his faction, that, you know, Deshara looking for super weapons could have such rippling effects years down the line.
Yeah. You know, it's almost, it's the group of authors planning out this story, making you, the reader, feel like you can trace something that none of the heroes of the story can, which is the will of destiny, the course of the Force, where it's going to lead all of these characters in a very dramatic fashion. And it's so pleasurable because you as a reader can analyze it, you could find things, and it helps you root for heroes because they're oblivious to that.
Yeah.
Right? It's something they can't foresee. Only the storytellers know that fact, and they don't. Anyway, we move to this Senator Iligos Akla, who is a pacifist. He's a very kind soul, right? And he willingly gave himself into the Yuuzhan Vong hands because he wants to meet with their war leader, Shidao Shai. And here we see a huge juxtaposition to what Kib Duran and his faction were doing, a kind of like very proactive, very militant kind of approach. Like, hey, this is a huge threat. These guys could completely destroy our galaxy. We need to act now. Snappy, let's go. Let's start jumping into our fighters and start attacking. I wanted to ask you, Meg, how did you feel about Luke's reservations in Vector Prime and in the first Dark Tide book versus the need to retaliation?
Yeah, I guess when I first started reading, a lot of my questions was like, why don't they try to open diplomatic relations with the Vaughn? Why don't they try to talk to them? And with, you know, Luke being so reserved and you're just like, you should take action. But then I'm also like, shouldn't you like reach out to the Vaughn? And I think the plot line with Elagos shows you that you can't, especially at this point in time, you can't reach out to them. You can't come to terms with them. They're not willing to settle for anything but, you know, complete domination.
Yeah.
I remember finding the seeds with Elagos completely heartbreaking because, yeah, he's a pacifist. He doesn't want to pursue violent ends for anything. And that ends up leading to his death.
Yeah. And do you think because of these what precipitated Eligos Akla's actions, do you think it's due to Luke's ineffectiveness early on of assessing the situation?
I don't think so. I think a lot of Luke's ineffectiveness is just from lack of information, which is fair. I mean, they know nothing about the Yuuzhan, and especially in Dark Tide Onslaught, we don't get a Yuuzhan perspective until the very end of the book when we're introduced to Shadal Shai. So the whole book, they're trying to find information about the Vaughn. Corrin and Ganner find out that the Vaughn had been there like 50 years earlier scouting, but they don't really know enough to take action. Right. And so Elagos's fate breaks my heart, but like I understand why he did it because it was an opportunity to learn more about the Vaughn, even if it ended in tragedy.
Yeah, it was definitely a heroic act. It's very interesting also how you are seeing the Luke's action, also this senator. I had a completely different read on it. I don't know why, but just right from the beginning, from Vector Prime, I got the sense of, which obviously I would be proven wrong later on with that other scientist lady that we're going to talk about in the future, but I was hell-bent on thinking like, no, these are not the people you negotiate with. Remember the famous lines from the original Terminator movie when Kyle Reese tells Sarah Connor, like, look, he can't be bargained with. He can't be reasoned with. It will never stop until you're dead. And same is happening with this Yuuzhan Vong. And when this senator goes and gives himself, I'm like, oh man, like, what are you doing, dude? It's like, you don't talk to these people. They're going to kill you. But with Luke, I didn't feel frustrated with him because being a huge fan of the Jedi Academy trilogy, I understood that Luke is coming from a standpoint of wisdom and experience. And he's saying, look, you youngsters, hold on a second. Don't rush off. Hold on a second. We need to meditate on this. We need to figure it out because we're trading a very thin line. It's almost like Spider-Man quote, like, with great power comes great responsibility. Same as Jedi. It's like there's a lot at stake here. And I felt that Luke's reservations were completely justified, but it didn't help matters when heartbreak happens in this chapter 2. And boy, there's a lot of heartbreak.
There is. Yeah. And I think for me, especially Dark Tide Ruin, it's such a Pyrrhic victory because it's like on the one hand, they save refugees, they get almost everyone off of Ithor. Corrin Horn has this duel, and the Shadal Shai is honorable. But then on the other hand, Shadal Shai, second in command, is not honorable. He completely reneges on his word, and I
definitely want to get to that. I have a couple of questions there for sure. Yeah.
So it's like, you save people, but at the cost of perhaps even more than what you saved. And it's like, oh gosh.
It's the beauty of the book, right? Where like you're reading it, and obviously it's out of your control because the book is done. It's written. It's not a video game. You can't manipulate events. Like, oh my God, this is happening. I wish it went the other. I think it's an excellent indicator that you're reading a truly special and book where you're emotionally invested, and you wish you could have changed events, but you can't, but you still keep reading. You know that the author has got you by the throat. He's like, I got you. You're in my grasp. That's a sign of a great, great author. moving right
Yeah.
along, you obviously mentioned quite a couple of things, which I really want to get your thoughts on. I really love how passionate you are about all of this stuff, just as I am. And, you know, we see the Jedi put on this fight, and Vong are now planning on the attack on Ethor because they discovered that the New Alliance is able to weaponize this new spore, which renders the Yuzong Vong bio armor useless. And they can't have that. It's a huge, huge thing there for them, a huge weapon that they found. And we see Shadao Shai murders Ilagos Akla in the most brutal way possible. He dismembers his body, and he sends those body parts to Corran Horn. It's like, this is what you're dealing with, peasant. And, you know, I just wanted to get a sense of how are Jedi responding to the threat at this point, with all the inner conflict and Luke trying to manipulate them and then Corran Horn trying to go a different route. Is their response to the Yuzong Vong threat in character at this point, or you felt like this stuff is not well written?
I felt like it was in character. And I think for me, what made it feel in character was that Corran Horn spearheaded their actions here, because Corran's always been a very impulsive person. Elagos meant a lot to him personally. They had this like strong connection. And so I could see how learning that Ithor is key, and then Elagos being murdered in such a heartbreaking way would lead Corran to go, okay, we've got to do this. And Luke, you know, me like, well, okay, if you're sure, because it felt like such a Corran move to me, that Luke as a younger man would rush into action, and now he's become, you know, much more cautious, and Corran hasn't really gained that. I felt,
even though he's same age, right, as Luke.
He's the same age as Luke, but he definitely feels more impulsive to me at this point in time.
And his journey will take him through like huge hurdles, and, you know, personal and as far as all of the Jedi are concerned. Yeah. Meg, before we move on, there's just one question that literally popped into my head right now. It's unscripted, but I gotta know. Before we move on in the story here and the future conversations that we'll have, in general, what is your like feelings or connection or thoughts about Ethor as the planet?
So I guess I don't know if I had any really strong thoughts about Ethor. Like, I remember it from some previous books where we would visit briefly, and it was like this beautiful paradise, and that the Ithorians, like, they don't even live on the surface. They live in these floating cities because, like, that's how beautiful and pristine their world is. So it didn't give me the same feelings as like Alderaan would, but knowing that Ithor is threatened by the Yuzong Vong, it did give me that sense of like, oh, this is bad. Like, this is, again, like Elagos, they're pacifists. They don't have weapons. They have no way to defend themselves against the Vong, which I think makes the threat against them even worse, because you know that without the Jedi and the military coming to their defense, they are defenseless.
You know, I have a completely opposite one here, because I remember growing up as a kid, and it's like, Alderaan, oh yeah, that's where Leia is from, and it just gets blown up in her face. Like, whatever, okay, let's move on. It's like, there's not enough content for you to associate with and care, especially when you're a kid. Like, oh, I guess it's bad, her planet got destroyed, right? But Ethor, when you see it like throughout the video games, right, and me being a huge fan of Knights of the Old Republic video game, and it sort of represented this verdant, beautiful, like you said, paradise, but also a beacon of goodness of this galaxy, right? This they revere the nature so much they don't even live on its surface. They build these discs, these cities in the sky, and to me, it represented the heart of this galaxy. It wasn't the Coruscant. Yeah. I don't know why. Maybe it was its combination of my thoughts towards prequels and just the way that the planet itself is portrayed. There's this metropolis, a planet-wide metropolis, where there's no sign of nature, and it's all like metal. Granted, it's beautiful architecture, but still, I felt like Ethor was the spiritual heart of the galaxy, and it just had so many warm, fuzzy feelings towards it. And that's why it was important for me to ask, because we're going to move right into the heart of the story, right?
Yes.
Shadao Shai, this complete badass war leader, right, guy. His lieutenant, Dane Leon, we find out that he works for his master Savong La, right? Mm-hmm. And together they plan to uproot and kill Shadow Shai. So what's your impression of the Vong culture, the inner conflicts? Did you have any favorite villains like that you just loved to hate on, or were just intrigued by their story, where it's going to lead?
I really like Shadao Shai because there was, on the one hand, he was very honorable, but on the other hand, he's just hyper violent, which was a very interesting juxtaposition, that there could be someone who's like, I have given you my word, and they stand by it. But this is the same man that like strangles Elagos, who, you know, had come to him in peace with his bare hands. And sometimes for me, the new Jedi Order, the Yuuzhan Vong, were almost cartoonishly evil, just like, you know,
really?
And I was, you know, kill all the children. But I liked how complex Shadao Shai was. I mean, he's only in one book, but he has such a presence.
Yeah,
I felt.
Yeah, definitely. You know, it almost felt like they are a combination of Krogans from the Mass Effect series or Klingons from Star Trek.
Yeah.
They're the space Vikings. And we understand, it's easy to understand them from the reference point where they're not preoccupied with our moral high grounds that we as human beings can relate to. Because obviously we learned that they mutilate themselves, they mutilate their bodies because they kind of adapt and survive and thrive through harshness of life, not through like comforts of life. And you kind of understand why they're brutal. It's not because that there's like, we're malicious kind of evil wizards from Dungeons and Dragons. Like, no, this is the way you conquer and devastate your enemy. This is how you thrive. This is how you survive. It feels like part of their invasion at this part in the story is like, hey, maybe they've left something behind in their previous galaxy that they're fleeing from. This is their way of survival. We don't have to agree with it. We don't have to abandon our morals and say like, yeah, they're kind of justified because they just want to survive. No, it's clearly bad what they're doing, but at least you can understand that point of perspective. The Imperial Remnant now is commanded by Grand Admiral Palayan. Mm-hmm. He is joined by the Chiss Expansionary Defense Force, and together they're joining the Republic. Even Chief of State Borsfilia joins with Leia, and they're here to come and observe this battle over Ethor because obviously it's an important planet. And this is also where Jaina meets with Jagat Fel. Also very, very important, two key characters. So what were your thoughts on now these gathering forces of this unraveling war theater of these major, major factions that warred against New Alliance now coming together against a common enemy? What kind of thoughts are you having in this part of the book?
Yeah, well, coming out of Vision of the Future with the New Republic signing a peace treaty with the Empire, I feel like this was exactly what I wanted for, you know, everyone to team up together against a threat. But at the same time, I could see how they already weren't getting along and how this alliance between them was probably not going to last. Especially knowing that there were more books to come with, you know, the future invasion. It was definitely interesting to see the tensions that already existed between Borsfilia and the military and the Imperial Remnant, and then even the Chiss within the Imperial Remnant that, you know, at this point in time, they're working against a common foe, but they don't like each other. And so it's sort of like, how long will you work together before this all falls apart?
Yeah, it's like almost like the Alliance versus the Nazi Germany. Like, hey, we have to work together. We have no other choice. But there's a lot of politics against one another coming, you know, behind the curtains. I think they were very effective in picking Palayan as the leader, as the reader, to be able to accept the fact that the former Imperial Remnant is now working within your alliance, that it's plausible at all. I don't think Timothy Zahn could have foreseen that he would become such a giant, massive character, because when you read about him in the original Throne trilogy, I felt like he is just the face of the new empire. He's like, okay, he's the one, he's the true believer. He will follow, Admiral Thrawn into Hellfires and back. He's the kind of loyal, but also intelligent one. He's not a yes man. He's not afraid of threats. He owns his mistakes. He demonstrates all the qualities that make you appreciate him even as an adversary. And now he joins the crowd. He's part of the group. But also both of us become prominent, and we have these prominent figure of Borg's failure and his career rising to its peak. What are your thoughts on both of us, and specifically on this character?
Borsk is such a... Well, it's interesting. When we were introduced to him in the Thrawn trilogy, you don't like him. He's slimy. And then when you see him again in the new Jedi Order, it almost seems like he's risen to his rank, not because he's done anything particularly good, but just because he's held out longer than anyone else. Everyone else has dropped out of politics at this point. So Borsk by default becomes the elder statesman.
Yeah.
And he's very selfish, which is interesting, and causes definitely conflict between him and Admiral Crayfay, who's the Bothan admiral, in charge of the New Republic fleet that's over Ithor.
Mm-hmm.
I like him for, how he causes conflict with Luke, but at the same time, I think that he comes across as just not stupid, because he's very scheming, but
he's
just
very cunning, yeah.
Very cunning, but so selfish that it makes me question at times that how much people would be willing to put up with him. But I guess that's sort of maybe the nature of power and politics, that sometimes when someone gets into power, they're into power until they choose to leave or everything implodes around them. So yeah, Borsk... he's just he's just...
I loved to hate him.
Yes.
I loved to hate him because he was very effectively played against the reader, where you constantly had to figure out where he's coming from, because he's clearly an effective statesman. He's an exceptional speaker, and he's a great manipulator. And you always try to dig into his character and try to figure out, okay, obviously what he's doing is out of selfish reasons, but is he playing 3D chess here? Is he trying to attain more power, but then at the same time, his heart is telling him what's the right thing to do? And obviously, in the interest of self-preservation, he still wants to help the New Alliance, because that's what you ought to do as a leader. The way that he talks to all the characters, I don't remember at one point, but sometimes he talks about to Jason, Jaina, the kids. He talks about the Skywalker family, and the way that he positions them into what he needs them to do. I never saw completely through him. I could never figure him out. And that's why I hated him. I'm like, oh my God, I know you're not coming out of the kindness of your heart. There's something more to you. And I can never figure out your steps. And I got to give it out. He travels hands from one author to the next and to the next and to the next. And they maintain that very strong line. I think this is the whole appeal of the character. This very shady, like you said, slimy character where you can't figure out his motivations.
Yeah, it's almost like whenever he sides with our heroes, you go, okay, what's going on? That can't be right. And so just the fact that, even when he does the right thing, you're wondering, okay, well, what's his deal? What's he doing here?
Yeah.
He does make a very effective, not villain, but antagonist for Luke and Leia to face off against.
Mm-hmm. And Meg, please help me out here, because I'm going to totally blank out. It's been years since I've read this series. I'm now re-listening it in audiobooks. I didn't get to Dark Tide 2, unfortunately, before our conversation. But I did write some notes on it, and we do have the first meeting of Jaina and Jagged Fell. Just wanted to get your thoughts on their first encounter. Did it give you any kind of foreshadowing, oh, okay, things are going to happen?
Yeah, well, I found it very interesting because it was sort of I felt like when they saw each other, they were like, oh, this person is interesting. And then they have a conversation, and Jaina comes out with it as he is so stuck up and he thinks he's better than me and he thinks he knows more than me. And Jag comes out of it sort of like, that girl is a wild card. She doesn't follow the rules. And so there's like that initial interest, but then they talk to each other and they're like, oh, I'm not sure about you. And so you know that they're going to have more interactions down the line, because it did give me almost like gender swapped Han and Leia feeling. I think Jag is a bit even more rigid and stuck up than Leia was, but it's almost like he sees Jaina as this like Han figure, this, figure that is just
unpredictable.
You can't nail them down to one thing. And she sees him and she's like, why does he act like he's better than me? He's not that better than me.
For me, it was very interesting to, I'm a huge Jaina fan, huge fan. I love all the struggles that she goes through. I love her romantic interest relationships. I love how male characters are played against female characters in the entire New Jedi Order. I was afraid in the beginning that Jagged Fell would be like this. Oh man, here's another like Han prototype. Like, well, hello here. I'm younger and I'm like bald-headed, but I work for Chiz, but I'm still sort of Han Solo. I was kind of afraid of that, but he very quickly turned around and became a different character. And I loved how his dynamic with Jaina continues on into several books later before sparks start flying. I'm like, I'm glad that you guys waited. I'm glad that you allowed this dish to like simmer a little bit just before we like start digesting the content. They didn't rush it. Like it didn't. If you were considering that Yuuzhan Vong felt cartoonish some way in their violence, then this relationship wasn't cartoonish at all. It was like, oh, boy meets girl. Like it's early 2000s book. Of course, she's gonna spoon for him. She's gonna get in love. No, it's treated very believably how two young people would, in their maximalist points of view, would clash versus one another, but then how through struggle they would find kind of like grow into each other.
Yeah. And I think that's very interesting how their relationship develops. And I think it's key that Jag goes away at the end of Ruin and then doesn't come back for a number of books, so that when they run into each other again and, have to work together, that Jaina really makes Jag like loosen up. And I feel like Jag makes her think more about the consequences of her actions so that she doesn't rush into things as much as she used to. So yeah, they like eventually bounce off each other very well.
I was rooting for Jaina. I'm like, oh man, I hope she gets the guy. Like, oh, she's hot. I'm reading it as a guy. I'm attracted to Jaina. She's kind of cool. She's nice. I'm like, what, 19, 20 when I'm reading this book. She's supposed to be like 18 in the book at that time. Yeah, somewhere we're around the same age. So I can relate to her a lot. And I'm kind of sympathize with her. Like, damn, I hope she gets the guy. Like, what the hell? Why is she leaving? Like, what's going on there? And we will move away from this, and now we're into this battle of Ethor. Many, many lives are lost. It's a devastating battle on both sides. And we are promised with this, there's a ceasefire, and Corran Horn presents Shadal Shai with a duel. He said, like, look, ceasefire, stop. It sort of reminded me of World War II scenarios between Russian and German trenches, where would literally cease fire, and German troops overnight would hear Russian soldiers playing harmonicas, and it's Christmas time or it's New Year's or something. People would literally stop fighting for a little bit and just to get a little respite from war. And that's what's happening here, because the Battle of Ethor completely, it just broke me, it devastated me. And we see Deshara Kor, along with many other characters prominent to this duology. She's on her dying bed, and her last words to Anakin are, "It wasn't your fault that Chewie died. I tried to go this dark path, and look where it got me. It's like, learn from me. And this is what I impart to you." And then, of course, she passes away. And once again, I asked you earlier in this podcast, and we're now returning to this question, your feelings on Anakin's path versus Jason, and how much of the characters surrounding Anakin influenced the way that he's going to go.
Yeah, Anakin is so I love Anakin. I love all the Solo kids. I think I love them equally, but if everyone asks, I'd be like, yes, I love Anakin the most. I love all of them the most. I can't choose. I love how Anakin, with Deshara Court telling him, it's not your fault. Don't go down the path I've gone. That Anakin has this guilt within him, but at the same time, the people he interacts with, he learns from them, and not just learns like what he should do, but what he shouldn't do. Like, he gets so many good examples from Mara, from Deshara Court, from his uncle. And he definitely feels to me like he's on the path of the hero, that he's going to become the next Luke, that everything he encounters is just making him become a better Jedi, a more grounded Jedi, which I guess is like the destiny feeling, that like he feels destined for a path different from that of his siblings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I felt that Jason, you start kind of analyzing this character as you read on into the series. And my personal take on him was he's too rigid. He's too preoccupied with the mental process, the philosophy, the thinking and analyzing and reevaluating, looking under every stone, where Anakin he navigates by his heart. He has this very strong sense of what's right, what's good, and how to go about protecting that without involving himself with the dark side. I feel that he is the most Christ-like figure in Star Wars, because from the beginning to the end of this franchise, this series, he, despite of terrible, terrible things that happen to him, he remains innocent in a way. In what I have just described, he's the type of kid, and that's why I felt for him so much. I absolutely love his character, that no matter what he does, and then of course later on we will discuss when Tahiri Vela is being involved there, he is the kind of kid that you can't help but love, because, and it wasn't the fact that he's like snotty, he's like, I'm always right, because I'm protege of the Skywalkers. There's just something to this kid that wasn't an influence from Luke or from his grandfather, Anakin. We don't know where it came from. But intuitively, he makes the right decisions because that's the right thing to do.
Yeah, Anakin is he feels like pure to me, that, Jason's questioning everything, and Anakin questions things too, but I feel like he never questions what he should do, that he always like sort of knows what he needs to do. And he has this like innate leadership quality that I think makes a lot of the younger Jedi look up to him and take him as an example. And that's something that his siblings don't have in the same way.
Yeah, you're right to point it out. Neither Jaina has that, because in the beginning of this series, you feel like Jason is going to be the one to show his younger brother the way, and he tries to explain to him like, well, this is what you're supposed to do as a Jedi. Well, he's kind of like swaggering around as a teenager, but he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. And he knows that too. Where Anakin remains what Bruce Lee called being water. Be like water, be fluid. He's always fluid. No matter if it's Luke teaching him or if it's life itself teaching him through a specific example in his life, he's always receptive. He's like, and before you know it, like it leads him on the right path.
Yeah.
And now we get to the climax of this book and this duology. One of the grandest scenes for me personally in this franchise. Not just New Jedi Order, in Star Wars franchise. The duel. Luke Skywalker and Dane Leon are serving as witnesses. It's a completely brutal, not fun kind of like, oh, cool Jedi action kind of scene. It's really, really brutal. And Corran Horn wins by the skin of his teeth. He is almost mortally wounded, but he manages to kill Shai. And Leon, as we find out, is the manipulator. He takes over the armies. And, of course, the attack on Ethor is full swing. Ethor falls. The planet is completely poisoned, devastated by the Yuzhan Vong bioengineered weaponry. The Alliance, in retaliation, destroys the Vong world ship called the Legacy of Torment, which is completely badass name. It is still Warhammer 40k now. I was like, oh, when I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, it's amazing. And then the New Republic blames the Jedi for this destruction. Corran Horn is labeled as the killer of Ethor, and he's exiled to Corellia. How did you feel with this climatic scene?
It was so intense. I feel like there were two scenes, especially in Ruin, that just were absolutely heartbreaking for me. And it was when Corran boards the ship and finds Elagos's body, and then just everyone watching as Ithor's poisoned and they can't do anything. And like, I got frustrated with Corran here before the duel, saying like, Corran, you're taking a lot on yourself. Like, if you fail, Ithor falls. And then it was so heartbreaking to see him win by the skin of his teeth. Like, he wins. But Dane Leon is an absolute garbage person. And just like destroys Ethor out of spite, it felt. And so it was so devastating to read, because you're cheering, you're like, Corran won, it's saved. And then the Vong prove that they can't be trusted, and they just turn around, and the description of like Ethor dying before their eyes is just so sad to read. Like that is one of the things from the new Jedi Order series that stuck with me even the first time I read it. Like when I thought back to those books, it was like, oh yeah, and Elagos was killed, and Ethor was poisoned. Like, it will never be what it once was.
Yeah. I felt that, as a big fan of Game of Thrones, and even the last season, even the last episode, where I was like, fans, what did you expect? You like George Martin, who pulls out the rabbit out of the hat? You expected something otherwise? That's the ending that you get. This is so George Martin, even though it's not his true ending. But I felt like by the second half of the series, it started exploiting violence to win show ratings, where things are happening for the sake of violence. Things are happening to amp up that, like, hey, you got to watch the next episode. Hey, the show is booming right now. Come back to the next episode. Where I felt this particular scene was constructed so well because the story took you there. It just didn't happen out of nowhere. It's leading you to this path. By this time, by book 2, who the Yuzhan Vong are, and that this conflict has just started. But still, when it's coming to Ethor, but when it happens, you can't help but feel like complete, total heartbreak. In general, what did you feel that there were some of the most key, important story elements in this duology?
So I think one thing was really people being humbled, like Corran being humbled in a way, because he took this impulsive action. He should have been triumphant, but instead he's now blamed by everyone. Ganner Rhysode started out the duology and he thinks he's right, he's cocky, and he learns by the second book that he doesn't know anything, that the Yuzhan Vong are a threat that he doesn't know how to deal with, and he really loses that impulsive nature and is much more cautious. And even Jason, who's trying to figure out his role in all that, and I feel like after Belkaden, he's sort of hesitant to pursue something because he saw a vision and it was wrong. So I feel like it definitely showed the invasion becoming even more real to our heroes, and
it brought it home, right? It brought it to your borders. Like, you felt like, oh, it's right here. It's happening right around the corner.
Yeah, it felt like what happened with Chewie and Vector Prime was heartbreaking, but Dark Tide duology brought it even more home, that this is a conflict like we've never seen before, and I'm not sure how they're going to be able to win here.
let's jump ahead just a little bit without giving the fans too much away in our discussion. Obviously, I imagine fans who've read the books or don't care about spoilers are watching this stuff. Now that you came back and reread this series, in retrospect, talk just a little bit about Jason's embrace of pain.
Yeah. So when Jason was captured on Belkaden in his failed attempt to free the slaves, he comes to and he's in the embrace of pain, which is this use and vol device that it basically you suffer the whole time you're in it, that it just like has you stretched and like your muscles are
it's supposed
pulled.
to test your faith, right? Something like that.
Yeah. And if you try to get in a better position, it will get you back in a bad one. And I think, especially for Jason going forward, it shows like how little control he has over things, that, you know, pain and his bodily autonomy, like in the embrace of pain, he has nothing. He's stuck until his uncle comes for him. And so I think a lot of Jason's arc is Jason learning that he has to open himself up fully to the Force. You know, he can't go into it with preconceived notions because, like, with the embrace of pain, he's not in control of anything. He has to open himself fully.
You know how I felt? I was just listening today before we started talking the podcast with Joe Rogan and George Peterson, and they talk about one segment of the podcast was on mass shootings in schools and how a lot of these kids that go about doing that first things that start happening with the alienation from society, that they feel ostracized, they feel cut off. There's nobody that they can relate to. Yeah. Whether through their actions or through the actions of the community, you know, the specifics were not mentioned. But I felt that this particular embrace of pain signaled something far more significant. I don't know what it was in the description of the scene itself. I just remember having that feeling where, holy crap, this is a point of no return for him. Something is happening here, which it's like a small shatter in the glass, a small little crack that you don't notice just yet, but it keeps on growing and growing and growing. And of course, that other little bird lady creature, which we will also discuss in our future talks, but that scene precipitated the beginning of the end. And I don't know why, like after I finished this duology, it just made me feel uneasy. Like I had to take a break. You know, I used to read these books concurrently with like going to college, and I would read them at night, like until 3 or 4 in the morning, and then 3 hours later I would go to school, which is totally unhealthy to do. If you guys are gonna read the new Jedi Order, that's not the mindset you want to read. But maybe that also played into my feeling like completely just like lost and like emotionally exhausted. But I knew that something is happening to Jason, which will be unprecedented.
Yeah.
Yeah. And last, I want to finish on this note where, you know, I constantly try to bring the canon and legends together. Like it makes no difference for me whatsoever. As far as I'm concerned, they're just two parallel timelines happening in the same universe. Same with you. You talk about legends, you talk about canon. Guys, we're going to keep discussing the new Jedi Order till we're done. We're going to hopefully run through all of the books. What would be your advice, suggestion to someone who's like, hey, I don't want to read Legends because it's kind of old right now. It's not part of the story. I'm just going to focus on the canon books here. What would be your main like invitation card for fans to read the new Jedi Order?
I think for me, the new Jedi Order, what I love so much is seeing how the characters grow, like the revelations they come to. And I think, you know, if you're interested in seeing Luke as a strong leader of the Jedi Order, if you're interested in seeing the next generation of Jedi coming to the forefront, it's just a really engrossing story that it's dark, it's grim, but you get caught up in it and you end up with favorites that you have to check in and see, how are they doing? How are they growing? Are they okay? Yeah, I think it's a 19 book series, which is really long, but it held me pretty much for all 19 books, which I think was quite a feat to accomplish.
Yeah, I'm gonna mirror what you're saying here, in that it's the ultimate showcase of well-structured story. You know, if you're sort of debating, you saw 2.5 lines on Twitter of somebody saying, well, you see, legends were never really canon, they were never really connected. Well, this new stuff is, this kind of fans will always need to compare stuff and
Yeah.
always say one is better than the other. Guys, I would tell you that forget the fact that our current Star Wars timeline is taking us in a different route. Treat it something as perhaps took place once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, right? That's the whole point. It's fiction. But I would suggest to you pick up a book today and start reading, even if you don't want to read our prerequisites, like we mentioned, the New Jedi Academy trilogy and the Throne trilogy. If you literally want to start with Vector Prime, the original book, I would say read it if you want to see a progression of story and characters, which are so well thought out. By book 19, you would feel like you lived with those characters. They say people who read and watch movies and play games and all this stuff, they live many lives. People who don't read, they live only one life. This is your opportunity to spend the time with Star Wars characters, which you may know nothing about. I granted, it might be a little bit intimidating in the beginning. Who is Jason? Who is Jaina? Who is Corran Horn? Wikipedia is there to help you. But if you persevere a little bit, if you're patient with it, it will show you one of the best constructed storylines I've ever seen in fiction. Before we part, Meg, any last words on this duology, and we'll wrap it up. Awesome covers by Nagano. The Japanese covers, I think I'm going to use them in thumbnail. I was kind of tinkering with it before we started recording. Like, okay, Mac is right around the corner. I'm running a little bit late myself. Let me just start throwing together a little thumbnail. I'm going to put Nagano's art in it because he brought so much character to this series. You guys should check it out just because of his artwork.
Yes, his artwork of the New Jedi Order books. Number one, it gives you a look at all these different characters who like never appeared on the covers of books. But when you look at it, you could just go, oh, that's Corran Horn. Oh, that's this person. That's that person. And I love how he portrays the original characters. I love how he portrays the next generation. Just like they're so cool to look at and look at all the details on.
Meg, please remind the fans where they can find your stuff and what's the next couple of videos they can look forward to.
Yeah, so I am on YouTube as Meg Reviews and on Instagram as The Meg Reviews. And I'm also on Goodreads as well, where I just post like normal book reviews. So I have a review, I think that just recently came out, where I revisited the novelization of The Phantom Menace by Terry Brooks. And then I have the young adult High Republic book Midnight Horizon to tackle next, as well as some Darth Maul novels and short stories that came out after The Phantom Menace. So before the developments that happened in the Clone Wars, when Darth Maul was just, this malevolent, shadowy figure and nothing more.
Well, guys, here we are. Meg, thanks for joining me. I had tons of fun about talking this duology. Sorry that I'm blanking out on a couple of key scenes and moments, guys. It's been years. I'm going to try to do my best to catch up, keep listening to those audiobooks, which is actually another option if you want to check those out. I do believe they're abbreviated. They're not full versions of the text, but still, it's a good opportunity for you to jump in and check out the New Jedi Order. As always, guys, thank you so much for tuning in, listening to us talk about our favorite topic, Star Wars. Please go check out Meg's channel at Meg Reviews. She does wonderful, wonderful reviews of each and every book, in detailed reviews with a lot of analysis, far more than I ever do in my books. I generally just go by gut feelings. And we hope that you will tune in next time. Meg and I will continue breaking down this franchise, talking about different characters and key events. And we'll see you guys next time. Take care.